Hi everyone, thanks for stopping by and for returning to the old world. Today something a little bit different, a little bit out of the usual sequence of releases, and inspired by some comments by Luke from Geek Gaming in relation to making Warhammer smaller and playing in different scales. And I thought I'd just throw my thoughts into the mix while it's relatively fresh. So, that being said, on to the main content. Why is it worth thinking about collecting war games in different scales? Well, I think there's 4 big reasons that immediately leap out. One of them is storage. We've all got a finite amount of space in order to put our miniatures. Some of us are fortunate to have more available space than others, but you can get an awful lot more smaller figures, and the figures that you can see in front of you are a mixture of 10 and 12mm fantasy models. You can get a lot of them in a box, which can take up less space than a 40k army or a fantasy army or whatever. The space thing also applies to the amount of space it takes to play a game. Now, if you've only got a limited amount of space, you can play a much bigger game using smaller scale models, either using the same rules where you've just perhaps moved from inches to centimetres, or by using rules designed for smaller scale. Of course, if you've got space for a full 6x4 or even a larger table, you can play much bigger games than you can using a 28mm game. This really takes me on to the third point, which is spectacle. If you are fortunate enough to be able to do a 6x4 table, or possibly even larger, you can do some truly massive battles in smaller scale. I think virtually everyone, unless you're incredibly fortunate in having access to a large amount of space, would struggle at 28mm to put on a battle like Gettysburg or Waterloo. But it's far more plausible, far more likely you can do this using smaller scales, be it 6mm, 10mm, even 2mm, should that be your fancy. And you can have rank upon ranks of troops, lots of fluttering banners, and it can actually, a table full of smaller scale models can look absolutely incredible. Different scales also provide a different hobby experience around things like painting. Whereas you might be looking to have each individual model at 28mm stand out as being an individual work of art, the smaller the scale, the more I think it's about that look of the collective and how they look as a unit. Now, if you're able to make a 10, 12mm figure, 6mm figure look absolutely fantastic, then absolutely go for it, go nuts. But there's, I think, less need for that. As a nice tidy paint job with minimal highlighting, if any at all, en masse can look really, really good. And also allows for the use of inventive scenic basing in order to portray the story of your army, all of which adds to spectacle, particularly in potentially quite large games. But that begs the question, isn't 28mm just better? And I should say, when I'm talking about 28mm here, I'm talking about the kind of the standard size, be it 28mm figures going into the what's now I think referenced to as the heroic 28mm, which are really probably 32, but there we go. So is 28mm better? No, it's just different. And as I mentioned, it happens to be the standard. Perhaps that's in part because it's easier for magazines to get nice pretty pictures out of them. It's for wargaming companies when they've got plenty of space to put on display games to then advertise their wares. You can get some really good effects out of 28mm figures. And we've also, of course, got some of the largest games out there looking at things like 40k and Warhammer Fantasy. These games have actually, I think, come out of a background of roleplay games where you don't need that many figures, so you can have larger ones to sell the story. They've then developed into mass battle games with lots of units and lots of troops. And whilst there were efforts, things like Epic and Warmaster, to move into different scales, the one everyone's stuck with has been that 28 and then increasing to the heroic 28mm. Now, different scales, I think, also appeal to different people. We've talked about some of the advantages that smaller scales may have, but when it comes down to things, simple things like, what do I prefer painting? Some people will like 28mm more than 10mm. Some people will prefer painting 12mm to 6mm, and so forth and so on. Playing your favourite game with different scale of miniatures just opens up the door to people who want to get different things out of the hobby, which is a great thing. Indeed, I think actually what you could even go as far as to mix the scales that you use. Now, I'm not talking about on the same battlefield, because that might, well, it would look a little bit strange, no might about it really. But you can use different scales for different types of game to sell the same story. So if you imagine, for example, a large-scale war, an orc and goblin invasion, the lands of the Empire. To start with, there's a clash of the scouts. Light cavalry battling it out using probably 28mm figures, a small skirmish game. Things develop, and the vanguards of the two advancing armies collide. Perhaps a strong cavalry force from the Empire is trying to hold off the opening gambit of the Orc infantry to make ground, buying time for the main Empire army to gather, to deploy on ground of its choosing and make ready to face the Green Hordes. Again, a game that can be fought with a dozen or so, half a dozen to a dozen units aside. 28mm sounds fantastic for that. And then comes the main game, representing thousands, potentially, of orcs and goblins charging forward, following the beats of their manskin drums. Facing them, the disciplined ranks of halberdiers, muskets, and archers, under the fluttering banners of Nuln, Reekland, Hockland, Tabard Helm. Massed ranks of guns blazing away at the attacking green hordes. You can picture in your mind's eye the sheer number of troops on that battlefield. And that's where going down to a smaller scale really leans into that spectacle and lets you not just have 8, 9, 10 units, but 20, 30, 40 units on the same sort of size table. Obviously, again, the more space you've got, the more you can pack in, but really adds to the spectacle of the grand battle rather than your classic Warhammer Fantasy or Warhammer 40,000, which in certainly my mind's eye really at most can represent a snapshot of a much wider battle. And these big battles can have, as I say, great appeal, and they offer you the opportunity to do something a little bit different, both on scale of the size of the battle and also the visual impact of it. Outside of this, it's perhaps also worth just thinking about what sort of companies you're dealing with when we're talking about smaller scale. Now, it tends to be, certainly I think largely has been historically, it's the big players you're looking at with your 28mm figures. If you want to do Warhammer Fantasy as it's intended, or 40k as it's intended, you're probably buying your models from Games Workshop, who are obviously massive. But when you look at the smaller scale stuff and the terrain that goes with 6 and 10mm models, for example, you see a very different array of models and a different type of person producing them. I'm going to use Hammerhead as an example here, which is one of the smaller, mid-size, maybe, shows in the UK. Now, you get a number of people going along and having stalls at this particular event that you wouldn't see at the big events like Salute, because they quite frankly can't afford to have a stand at Salute because it's so expensive and it's so large. And these are the companies where you get someone who makes terrain, for example, for World War II war games at 10mm, and they do it as a hobby around their job, and then the proceeds of the sales they make funds them expanding their range and being able to continue to make terrain. And you see some really nice things, but stuff you wouldn't really stumble across elsewhere because you need to know it's there to go looking for it, because if you're looking on the internet you're probably going to find the major players first, because that's kind of the way search engines will work. Whereas diving into smaller scale stuff will allow you to touch into some of perhaps the smaller manufacturers and get some really interesting things. So just really some thoughts from me on smaller scales. There's definitely some advantages to it. It allows you to hobby in different ways. I fully accept smaller scale stuff isn't for everybody. Personally, I find painting smaller scale stuff less interesting than 28. Maybe that's just out of familiarity, but it's definitely a factor. But ultimately, it comes down to hobbying your way and getting the most out of your spare time and getting the most enjoyment you can out of it. Have you got any games you like to play in different scales? Maybe 6mm or 12mm? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, this is Return to the Old World. Have a great day.